and then I'll give a brief introduction. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Public Forum Debate Academy. Today, we're featuring Randal O'Toole, who is an expert on transportation policy, and he's conducted research and written academic articles on high-speed rails. He was a former scholar at Yale, Berkeley, Utah State, and also the Cato Institute, and is an economist with over 45 years of experience critiquing public land, urban transportation, and other government plans on the website The Anti-Planner, which I'll link in the description. Today, we'll be focusing on the public forum debate topic for September and October, which is resolved: the United States federal government should substantially increase its investment in high-speed rail. So Mr. O'Toole, I just wanted to get started with your experience on research generally, and also your focus on high-speed rails and transportation. Where is basically your kind of expertise, and how did you get interested in researching high-speed rails and so forth?
Well, my interest came from two different directions. Academically, I'm trained in forestry, geology, and economics. Practically, I've spent my career, which, as you say, is over 45 years, and actually is pretty much over 50 years now, looking at government plans. And I dig into government plans, things that most people never read. So, for example, a government plan for high-speed rail or light rail might say, oh, we've got terrible traffic congestion, we've got pollution, we've got energy consumption, and so we need to do something, and this is something, and so we need to do this, which of course isn't very logical. But then you get deep into the plan, if anybody reads that far, and I'm one of the few who does, and you find out if you build this project, you're going to have more congestion, it's going to use more energy, it's going to produce more pollution and greenhouse gases than if you don't build the project. So they say one thing at the beginning of these documents, and then their actual documentation shows that it doesn't do those things. That's what I do. I review these documents. I call myself the anti-planner because I oppose government planning when it ends up becoming promoting boondoggles like this. Now, my other interest is I love passenger trains. I've always loved passenger trains. I rode my first passenger train when I was 5 years old, and I've never wanted to do anything else. And so the idea of high-speed trains sounds really neat to me. But on a practical level, we already have transportation that's much better and much less expensive than high-speed trains. And so I've ended up being a critic of them.
That makes sense. So basically two different directions, one a more academic view, and then second, a more kind of interest view. So now I want to get started with basically fundamental considerations with high-speed rail. Those might be big disadvantages, like I know a lot of scholars talk about cost. What, in your opinion, are the big disadvantages or the big considerations policymakers have to take with high-speed rail and its implementation?
Well, the real problem is that high-speed rail requires expensive, dedicated infrastructure. And it's not just expensive to build, it's expensive to maintain. Because if you're driving on a highway at 60 miles an hour, it has to be relatively smooth. But if you're going 100 to 150 to 200 miles an hour, it has to be absolutely perfect. One little bump and it can fly you off the road and kill you. So high-speed rail infrastructure must be absolutely perfect, and it must be maintained absolutely perfect, all of which is extremely expensive. In contrast, we have this thing called jet airplanes. And the United States flew the Boeing 707 in 1958 and the DC-8 in 1959. And they flew at 600 miles an hour, which was four times faster than the Japanese high-speed trains when they opened in 1964. So here we already had a method of travel that was much faster than high-speed rail. And guess what? It requires almost no infrastructure. It requires the air. That's all it really needs, and a place to land. And, you know, we have these fancy airports with jetways and restaurants and things like that, and moving walkways. but we don't need that. All a plane really needs is a place to land, which could be a farmer's field, and then a ladder to get people up and down, or a stairway to get people up and down on and off the plane. And if that, the neat thing about planes was they could start out simple, and if they became popular, you could add these things, these amenities like moving walkways and jetways and fancy restaurants in the airports, but you didn't have to. With high-speed trains, you have to start out with all the expensive stuff first before you find out if it's going to work, if people are going to use it. And so you have to spend all this money up front, and that huge infrastructure requirement is really the downfall for high-speed trains.
Right. So I see, one, the upfront costs are a huge thing. And then secondly, the alternatives already function, and in fact, they function better than high-speed rails.
That's right. And in 1998, a transportation engineer at University of California at Berkeley named David Levinson looked at the comparison of the cost of high-speed trains between Los Angeles and San Francisco versus flying or driving. And he didn't know how much it would cost to build a high-speed train. So he made a guesstimate of $10 billion to build the high-speed rail line. And at a cost of $10 billion, he found it would cost more to move people from San Francisco to Los Angeles by rail than either by flying, which of course is faster, or by driving, which is more convenient because you can go where you want to go instead of where the stations are. And of course, now we know it's going to cost $100 billion, 10 times as much. And so it made no sense from the very start, and yet people still fund it. And I think it's because it's a way of transferring money from taxpayers into the pockets of potential campaign donors, namely construction companies and labor unions.
I see. So the next questions will come from debater submitted questions regarding high-speed rails. They also looked a lot at your Cato article about costs could be as higher than $4 trillion if a high-speed rail line was implemented similar to that of China's or longer. So that's what these questions will now focus on. The first one comes from Johnny, who says, how do you see an American high-speed rail line, if implemented, comparing to that of the one in China or ones in Europe?
Well, the first thing you have to understand is that we live in a political society. We live in a democracy. And if a private entity like Apple Computer or Ford Motor or Tesla Motor decides to make something, then people can decide to buy it or they can decide not to buy it. But if the government decides to make something, then you don't have any choice. You end up having to support it with your tax dollars. Now, if the federal government decides to support high-speed rail in California, pretty soon people in Wyoming and South Dakota and Wisconsin are going to say, where's ours? How come California gets it and we don't? And so in 2009, the Obama administration published a map of proposed high-speed rail lines around the country, and there were no lines to places like Cheyenne, Wyoming, or for that matter, Denver, Colorado, or El Paso, Texas, or Phoenix, Arizona. Instead, there were lines mainly on the coast and in the Midwest. So a year later, they published a new map, and the new map had lines going to Cheyenne, Wyoming, which is really a small city. Another line went to Duluth, Minnesota. Why did they send a line to Duluth? Well, it turns out the chairman of the House Transportation Committee at the time represented Duluth, Minnesota. So what we had was a system where politicians got their cities added to the high-speed rail network, the proposed high-speed rail network, just so that they could go to their voters and say, look, I got you this, vote for me, vote to re-elect me. This is what's happened in Japan. This is what's happened in China. This is what's happened in Spain. In other countries, they start to build a high-speed rail line in places where they think it's going to make sense, like supposedly Paris to Lyon high-speed rail makes sense, makes money. or Tokyo to Osaka, but then they end up building high-speed rail lines to small towns, to places that can't possibly support it, but the government funds it because there are politicians who want it there. So that's what we would see happen in the United States. We'd say, okay, we're going to have them where they make sense, like Orlando to Tampa and San Francisco to Los Angeles, but pretty soon you'd be building them to El Paso and Reno and all kinds of little places where they can't possibly make sense.
Right. Sounds like there's a lot of political sway in how these large projects are built. All right. Now, the second question is from two debaters, actually, Aiden and Shang, who say, or are questioning the Cato figure of a high-speed rail in the United States costing upwards of $4 trillion to implement if it was longer than China's. They just wonder, how was this number gotten to? Which railways did you use to estimate the cost and so forth?
Well, at the time and today, there's only one high-speed rail construction project in the country, and that's California. And so far, they've been building on flat land in the Central Valley of California. And they spent an average of $167 million a mile on this flat land. Now, they also have to build over some mountains to get to Los Angeles and to get to the San Francisco Bay Area. They estimate it's going to cost $200 million a mile to go over the mountains. Now, personally, I find that hard to believe. Building in the mountains is a lot more expensive than building on flat land, and they're assuming it's going to be 20% more expensive. That sounds very unlikely. But what I did is I took the various high-speed rail proposals that have been made, including the 2009 Obama proposal, a proposal by a graphic artist who made a map of the United States. I think his name was Albert Twu. And then there's a proposal by something called the United States High-Speed Rail, HSR. Basically, I suspect it's a consortium of companies that are going to make money building it, and so they put up a website. And finally, there's the idea that we need more miles than China. Pete Buttigieg says he wants the United States to become the world leader. China at that time had 22,000 miles, so I figured we had to have more than 22,000 miles to be the world leader. So for each of these networks, I estimated how many of their miles are in the mountains and how many are on the flat. And then I used $167 million a mile for the flat and $200 million a mile for the mountains, even though I'm skeptical that that number is realistic. Multiplied it through, and it ended up being well over $1 trillion for the 2008 or 2009 Obama high-speed rail plan, on up to more than $4 trillion for a 23,000 mile system. So that's where the numbers come from. They're based on real world evidence of how much it costs to build high-speed rail in this country. And people can say, well, China doesn't spend that much on high-speed rail. Yes, and China has labor costs that are a lot lower than we have. And they have an autocratic government that can dictate where things go, and they don't have to go through years of planning and working with landowners and things like that. In that country, the government owns all the land. In this country, we have a lot of private landowners who will object to having high-speed rail built across their land, and that's going to increase costs. So you have to take those things into account. You can't just say, well, in China, they only spent this much, so therefore we can do that here. Nope, it's not going to work. Right.
All right. The next question comes from a debater known as Sahil, and he asks, why is it that only up to 2% of riders would use high-speed rail?
Well, there's two ways of answering that question. I mean, he might be asking how I calculated that. But the answer to why it is simply that flying is cheaper and faster, driving is cheaper and more convenient, and high-speed rail is going to be way more expensive than either one. And so people are going to end up not using high-speed rail for most trips. There might be somebody who's going from downtown Los Angeles to downtown San Francisco who will take high-speed rail because there's a station in those downtown areas. But guess what? Less than 8% of all jobs in the United States are located in downtowns. And so most people aren't going to be living near a station. Their destination is not going to be near a station. And so they're going to drive or they're going to fly. I mean, Los Angeles has 5 or 6 commercial airports, and San Francisco has 3 or 4 commercial airports, depending on how big you count the Bay Area. If you count Santa Rosa, it's 4 commercial airports. And so if you fly, you're more likely to be able to start out closer to where you are and end up closer to where you want to go than if you take a train. If you drive, you're definitely going to be able to have a much more convenient trip than if you take a train. So people just aren't going to use high-speed rail because it's not going to be cheap, it's not going to be convenient, and compared to flying, it's not going to be fast. It's not going to be fast. Now, how I calculated this is I found a document that was developed by some pro high-speed rail advocates. They wanted to show that they wanted to compare technologies to see which would produce the most greenhouse gases. And they compared maglev versus conventional high-speed rail versus conventional slow-speed rail versus other technologies. And they had to estimate ridership for all of their technologies. And basically, you look at all the passenger miles we travel in this country. The average American travels more than 18,000 miles a year, every year, except for during big pandemics and so on.
Right.
We travel 16,000 miles by car. We travel more than 2,000 miles a year by plane. And then we travel several hundred miles a year by bus, by bicycle, by walking. And guess what? We travel 19 miles a year by intercity train. 19. We bicycle more than we travel by intercity train. That's not because there aren't enough trains out there. There's lots of Amtrak trains out there and they're running half empty. It's because they aren't convenient, they aren't fast, and they aren't cheap. So if you look at all the travel people do and you compare it to how much these high-speed rail proponents were projecting people would do under various high-speed rail plans, it ended up being their most ambitious plan would only move about 0.5% of all passenger travel in this country. That most ambitious plan was a little more ambitious than the 2009 Obama high-speed rail plan. So I scaled up. I said, if we build 23,000 miles so that we have more miles than China, the Obama plan was, I believe, 12,000 miles or something. So if we scale up, I estimated high-speed rail couldn't possibly carry more than 2% of all passenger travel in this country. The other thing worth noting is that highways move more than passengers. They move a lot of freight. They move about 40% of all freight moved in this country. Airports also don't care about passengers versus freight. You have UPS and FedEx and other air freight companies moving freight out of airports on giant jet aircraft. High-speed rail lines would be nothing but passengers. They would move no freight except for any luggage a passenger carried aboard. So you'd have this huge, expensive, dedicated line that would only be good for one thing, and it wouldn't be used very much for that one thing.
I see. So yeah, I can agree that a huge problem with high-speed rail would be that convenience, right? Especially with airlines and road travel, you're able to have multiple uses for transportation, whereas these high-speed rails would only be to transport people and not perhaps things and goods.
That's right.
The next question comes from Franklin and Nicholas, who ask, do you believe there are any clear benefits to high-speed rail?
Well, as a rail fan, I think taking pictures of trains is neat. And, you know, the idea that there's some kind of national pride in having the latest technology is considered a benefit. But we're talking about the latest technology of what is, after all, an obsolete technology. It would be like having national pride in having the fastest electric typewriter. or national pride in having the fastest landline telephone that you could dial from faster than anybody else's landline telephone, or national pride in having a slide ruler that could make calculations faster than any other slide ruler, but not faster than a laptop computer or even a $5 pocket calculator. So we're talking about national pride in an obsolete technology. And this all started back in 1964 when Japan built its first high-speed rail line. And in 1964, America was subject to an inferiority complex. We were afraid that the Russians were ahead of us in the space race. We were afraid that the Russians were ahead of us in the missile race. There were all these technologies that Russians seemed to be ahead of us in, and we were afraid that this was going to lead to our long-range downfall. And then for years, the United States had the fastest trains in the world. They had been trains between Chicago and Minneapolis. And every year, Trains magazine published a list of the fastest trains in the world, and it was always the United States. And then suddenly these upstart Japanese have a train that's faster than ours, and it contributed to our inferiority complex. And people forgot, well, we do have these airplanes that are 4 times faster than the Japanese trains. And suddenly there was a worry that we had to have high-speed trains. And so Congress actually passed a law that funded high-speed trains between Boston and New York, and they had a high-speed turboliner that went from Boston to New York, and then a high-speed metro liner that went from New York to Washington. And although the trains are capable of going 160 miles an hour and therefore beat the 140 miles an hour that the Japanese trains went, in actual practice, they only went about 110 miles an hour. And to me, that was totally unnecessary. Why did we need it? And since then we've spent billions of dollars, and we're going to be spending tens of billions of dollars more to maintain that high-speed rail line between New York and Washington. And why do we need it? We have buses that can take people round trip for $20, and it costs $200 to take a high-speed train one way between New York and Washington. It's silly that we're spending all this money on an obsolete technology merely out of a feeling of national pride.
Right. It almost seems that like during the period of 1965 when Japan implemented its high-speed rails, in the following years, the US was kind of on an infrastructure arms race where it was just building up, modeling other countries without real consideration for economic merits of the projects.
Well, there was, I wouldn't go so far as to say that. Certainly the New York or the Boston to Washington corridor was funded without consideration as to the merits of the project. Outside of that, we had conflicting policies on transportation. For example, highways were always funded out of user fees. And the interstate highway system was 100% funded out of user fees. And it was funded on a pay-as-you-go basis. So if people weren't using it, they wouldn't have had any money to build more of it. So we only were able to build it because people actually used it. Airports had received some subsidies, but as of 1970, all federal subsidies to airports ended. So no more federal subsidies to airports. Airlines have received some subsidies, and as part of the COVID relief, they received subsidies, and airports received subsidies. And most of it was in the form of loans that the airlines all paid back. But that was the time when we started becoming irrational regarding rail. Amtrak was created in 1970 on the theory that it would relieve the burden of passenger train subsidies that was causing railroads to go bankrupt. In fact, that wasn't what was causing railroads to go bankrupt. What was causing them to go bankrupt was overregulation. And railroads continued to go bankrupt after Amtrak took over the passenger trains until 1980, when we deregulated the rail lines, we revitalized the rail industry, and we have a very healthy, the healthiest rail system, and probably the most advanced rail system in the world, certainly the most profitable rail system in the world. that operates almost entirely without any government subsidies except for to the passenger trains.
I see. So the next question comes from Abraham, who asks, what are you currently involved in or working on right now with regards to public transportation and so forth?
Well, I'm monitoring transit ridership and Amtrak ridership in the wake of the pandemic. American driving reached 100% of pre-pandemic levels as of, I believe, June 2021, and has been right around 100% or a little more than 100% ever since, showing that we really have recovered from the pandemic economically. Flying is about 90% of pre-pandemic levels. Amtrak is around 80% of pre-pandemic levels. Urban transit is only 60%, and it seems to have plateaued. It reached 60% several months ago and has not advanced beyond that since then. And so what I see is that people have changed their travel habits, they've changed their work habits, they've changed their locations. A lot of people moved out of big cities to smaller towns or suburbs or ex-urban areas. And a lot of downtown jobs, and transit mainly served downtowns because you had hub and spoke transit systems that made it easy for people to get to downtown on transit, but it was hard to get anywhere else on transit. So a lot of downtown jobs have fled the downtowns. Downtowns today are about 60 to 70% empty compared to what they were before the pandemics. Many of the offices are still occupied, but by companies are still leased, but they aren't full of employees. And it doesn't look like a lot of those employees are going to be moving back downtown, at least not 5 days a week. Instead, when they do move back downtown to their offices, it's like 2 days a week. So transit, I think, transit was losing ridership before the pandemic. It lost another 40% of its riders in the pandemic, and I don't think they are going to come back. So I seriously question a lot of the plans that transit agencies have, such as Austin, which wants to spend $8 billion building light rail. And other cities, Los Angeles keeps building light rail. Portland wants to build new light rail. Seattle is in the midst of building a bunch of light rail lines. All of that's going to be a total waste of money because people aren't going to ride it.
I see. It's almost as if these not high-speed rails, but just transit in general is tied strongly to the urban centers, and with the pandemic and Zoom and the growth of those technologies, it seems that the unique benefit of transit has diminished a little bit, whereas maybe other types of transport in suburban areas like roadways or a city to city like planes has grown or stayed at least steady.
Well, even before the pandemic, I questioned whether transit was providing any real benefits in our cities. If you look at maps of transit lines in 2019 and compare them with maps of transit lines in 1919, you'll see the lines really haven't changed anything. They haven't changed at all. And that's because they were focused on downtown. In 1919, most urban jobs were in factories, and most factories were located in downtowns. And by 1950, if not by 1930, most of those factories had moved out of downtowns. And so what were left were finance jobs, what are known as finance, insurance, and real estate jobs were downtown. And a lot of those jobs moved out in the pandemic. But even those jobs, even before the pandemic, that was a very small number of jobs. As I say, it was less than 8% of all jobs in the country. In New York, it was about 22% of jobs in the New York urban area. Everywhere else, it was 10% or less. So transit sort of served those jobs. And you had places like Chicago where more than half of all workers who worked downtown were taking transit to work. But then you had Chicago O'Hare Airport, which was surrounded by a lot of offices and industry, and it had almost as many jobs as downtown Chicago, and only 5% of those people took transit to work, even though it was on the Chicago elevated line. So transit wasn't working for anybody except for some people who work downtown. And that wasn't very many people. So why are we throwing all these huge subsidies that was costing everybody just to benefit the 5% of people who are actually riding transit? It didn't make any sense.
Right. The final question comes again from Johnny, who asks specifically, what are the impacts of high-speed rail on the environment?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, there's huge land impacts because you have to disturb a lot of land to build high-speed rail. Potentially, there could be wildlife impacts if you're interrupting wildlife corridors. You're in a lot of places, they're disturbing farmers, they're dividing farmers' land, and it's really hard to manage land when you have to somehow cross to get to the other side, and maybe have to drive miles out of your way to get to the part of your land. There'd be impacts in wildland areas and forest areas as well. I think, however, the real environmental issue that people are concerned about today is global warming and greenhouse gases. And it takes an enormous amount of greenhouse gases to build high-speed rail lines. Concrete requires lots of greenhouse gases when you make concrete. Steel, making steel requires lots of greenhouse gases. And then moving earth, digging tunnels, building bridges, and so on and so forth requires lots of petroleum petroleum machinery. And so you're going to generate enormous trillions of pounds of greenhouse gases to build high-speed rail lines. And then they say, well, operating high-speed rail will save greenhouse gases. Well, it might. But the truth is that we don't know that for sure, because high-speed trains require a lot more energy to move than low-speed trains. The Japanese one of the Japanese railways estimates it costs about 50% more greenhouse gases to move a high-speed train than a conventional train per mile. So you're moving people, unless you get 50% more people, you end up spending more greenhouse gases per passenger mile. And with the way they set up high-speed rail lines, where passengers are going to get on at one station and get off at various stations in between, passenger loadings are going to end up being about 50%, just like Amtrak's passenger loadings today. So the amount of greenhouse gases you save in the operations will probably never come close to covering the amount of greenhouse gases you generate in building the line. And that's not even counting for the fact that about every 30 years, you have to go back and completely rebuild the line. You have to replace the rails. You have to replace a lot of the concrete. And so you're generating even more greenhouse gases every 30 years. So if you can't recover the cost in 30 years, then you're lost. You're never going to be able to recover the cost, because you end up spending more cost every 30 years on reconstruction. So to me, high-speed rail is a net loser. And this is another case where you have to read deep into the documents. There was a company that wanted to build a maglev line from Washington to Baltimore. And their pitch was, hey, this will save a lot of greenhouse gases. So I read their environmental impact statement, and the environmental impact statement showed that for every passenger they would take off of Amtrak, they would end up using more greenhouse gases to move that passenger than Amtrak would have used. Wow. So they're ending up spending more greenhouse gases. And if they got somebody out of a car, they'd also spend more greenhouse gases than driving. So in that case, maglev, which is supposed to be even faster than high-speed rail, ends up being a huge energy consumer and a huge greenhouse gas emitter.
I see. Well, thank you for discussing high-speed rails, public transport. I think we covered a lot of different topics, from the environment to the economy to political considerations like political influence. So I think this will be a great help for debaters. So thank you.
All right. Let people know if they have if they want to contact me. My email is rot@ti, that stands for Thoreau Institute, ti.org, rot@ti.org. I'll be happy to handle your questions. I have received a few phone calls, people asking me to return their call and failing to give me a return number. So please send me an email, because then I'll have your contact information and I can get right back to you.
Perfect. Thank you.